Okay.
So we are going to talk about the Parsha we read yesterday, Parsha of Shoftim, which means judges. And it's the judges are a big part of the actual Parsha, the laws of how to be a good judge and not bias and have just in the society. But a section of the Parsha is also about the kings, what should be the role of a king and how should a king behave. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. Do we need to do the housekeeping here or?
No, that's fine.
Okay, so a little summary on the Parsha. So we are in the whole section of Moses' speeches, right? In the end of his life. And Moses is instructing the people of Israel to appoint judges and people to enforce the law in every city, in every area. And he tells them that the very famous verse, justice shall you pursue. He commands them, and you must administer it without corruption or favoritism, right? A lot of things that, in our life today are supposed to be very obvious, but back then, the king or whatever, it was not necessarily very clear, what's happening. So that's one section of the Parsha, including the very important part of you need at least two good witnesses to convict somebody with a punishment. That's the first section. The second section is talking about idolatry and sorcery. And then to the section where we are talking today is governing and appointing the behavior of a king and guideline for creation of city of refuge, Ir Miklat, which is for people who killed by accident. And there is also a lot of rules about war, how to behave in a war, what you can and can do. And then in the end of the Parsha, there is a whole section about egla, arufa. Egla, arufa is a very interesting section that talks about what happened if we find a body of somebody that was killed, and we have no idea who killed it, and he's just lying around like in between two cities, and we don't know where he came from, who did it. So how do we behave, and who is taking responsibility on that? So that's just a summary in a nutshell. And here I brought a few verses who are directly connected to the king and how the king needs to be behaving and what's the rules and so on. And it's from chapter 17, verses 14 to 20. And I'll read a few. You shall be free to set a king over yourself, one chosen by the eternal your God. Be sure to set as king over yourself one of your own people. You must not set foreigner over you, one who is not your fellow Israelites. Moreover, he shall not keep many horses or send people back to Egypt to add to his horses. Since God has warned you, you must not go back that way again. And he shall not have many wives, lest his heart go astray, nor shall he amass silver and gold. He is seated on his royal throne. He shall have a copy of the teaching of the Torah written for him on a scroll by the Levites. Let it remain with him and let him read it, meaning the Torah, all his life, so that he may learn to revere the eternal his God, to observe faithfully every word of the Torah. So that's the famous verses regarding, who should be king and how he should behave. And then I brought here a few verses about the reality, what happened with actual kings, Jewish kings from the Bible. So the yellow is from Saul. So it says about him that Saul said to Samuel the prophet, I have sinned, for I have transgressed the command of the Lord and your words, because I fear the people and obey their voices. This is in the case of the Amalekim, where he didn't kill everybody, right? He left the king alive, and he left some of the sheep alive, and he didn't obey the commandment to destroy everything. And we know that because of that, his kingdom was taken from him. And then in green, it's about King Solomon, and it says that King Solomon is praying to God, give your servant an understanding how to judge your people, to discern between good and evil, for who can judge this great people of yours. This is something that King Solomon is praying to God. It's also said he had 700 royal wives and 300, I don't know how to pronounce this, and his wife turned his heart away, right? So he as much as he was obeying God, he had this issue that he had too many wives, which we saw before at his opinion. And then it says a little bit after, for when Solomon was old, his wife turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God. So we see the consequences of what happened when he had a lot of wives. They start convincing him to do other stuff and not be 100% faithful to Hashem. And I added here a few stories about the kings. So here about King Saul, like we said, and the Amalek, that he did not obey and he did not kill all the sheep and the cattle. God tells him, because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he also rejected you from being a king. So that's one part of the Parsha. And there is about King David and the sin of Bathsheba and Uriah. And the last one is Uzziah entering the temple and burning incense when he was not supposed to. This is all examples of kings who did some kind of mistake. They were, generally speaking, loyal to God and good to the Jewish people, but they had all kind of mistakes, and we have here the examples of different stories from the Bible. And I brought 3 commentaries about the previous verses, the first verses. So the Ramban, he says on the verse, he must not acquire many horses for himself. So he explained that. He's saying he should not trust in the multitude of his chariots and the strength of his horsemen, but rather he trust should be in God. Meaning, if a king will have a lot of horses and he will feel strong, then maybe he will not feel the need to trust in God, because he will feel he's very strong and he doesn't need God to help him. So that's one explanation. And then about the whole keeping the Torah with him. So the Torah shall remain with him, and he shall read from it all the days of his life, to observe the words of the Torah. So the explanation on that is the king is commanded to be subject to the Torah, so that he should not think that because of his greatness and authority he may act according to his own will. Meaning, he needs to remember that he's acting only on behalf of the Torah. That's why not only he needs to have his own Torah, but he's actually walking around with somebody holding it for him, or him holding it, just like the president is holding the codes for the nukes, right? Just in case he always needs to have it. So that's the same thing. He's walking with the Torah, so he never forgets where he's coming from. And then the last verse, so that his heart may not be lifted above his fellow Israelites. That's one of the things that the king is commanded. He needs to be part of the people. So the explanation is he must not consider himself above his brothers. The king has greater authority than everyone else, but the Torah insists that he must never see himself as greater in human worth than the people he leads. Meaning, he's just a person, he's just an average citizen that God gave him power, but he himself is just a regular person, just like everybody else, so he could not feel or act as if he's above the rest of the nation. Now I have the questions, and I had like the main questions in bold, and then some kind of explanation and after. So question number 1, it's about power and limits. Can a leader hold great power without being changed by it? So why does the Torah place restrictions specifically on the most powerful person in the country? Is the danger the power itself, or the fact that power can cause a person to begin trusting in his own strength, wealth, or status? And if a leader is a good and moral person, should we still limit his power, or can we simply trust him? So that's the first question. Second question is, how does a leader remain one of the people? So is it possible to have great authority and power while still not seeing yourself as better or more important than others? And what happens to a person when everybody obeys him, respects him, and depends on his decisions? And should a good leader see himself as one of the people, or does effective leadership require a certain distance from the people he leads? There is always this debate. Question number 3, who ultimately governs the leader itself, the law, or higher values? So should a leader remain bound by the laws and values that stand above him, even when he believes he knows what is best for the country? Is it better to trust the character of a good leader, or to build a system of laws and limits that protect society even if the leader changes? And ultimately, is a true leader the ability to control others or the ability to control yourself? And then last question about Saul and Solomon. What makes a leader truly great? So should a leader listen to the people? Okay, like Solomon, he asked God to listen, or like Saul, or should he stand by what he believes is right? And do even wise and successful leaders need limits to keep power from changing them? So that's the 4 questions we have today. Yeah, and that's it for today.
I've already put the questions into the chat, so you have them. Ruth, would you moderate?
Yes, absolutely. I just don't see the questions in the chat. I see a link from Moshe about cats and dogs, but just let me see. Yeah, there seems to be only 2 things in the chat.
The question did not come in the chat for some reason.
Yeah. Would you put us back on gallery, Jonathan?
Oh, I see. It's bigger. It doesn't allow to pass because it's too big a message. Okay, I'll put them in separate. I'll put them in 2 separate parts. Okay. I see.
Jonathan, take us off the presentation mode and then we'll just have each other and the questions. Perfect.
You have the questions now, right?
Yes.
And I also put in something about the migration and the connection to Israel because there's a very inherent connection between the two.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Indeed.
An amazing passage and a really thought-provoking set of questions. So the first question is about a leader holding great power and not being changed by it. Who would have a comment? Oh, Alan does.
Always.
And how do
You
we
can
deal
always
with it?
trust Alan.
Yeah.
One of the commentaries on the Torah notices that the Torah broke precedent in history because prior to the Torah, it was the law of rule. Whoever was king made the rules for himself, for everybody else. Once the Torah arrived, it became the rule of law. It flipped that whole paradigm on its head. And if you go through the Torah, there seems to be a separation of powers idea. That's where the American experiment got its concept of separation of powers. You had a Sanhedrin, you had a king, you had courts, you had a hierarchy of courts. So power is essentially distributed within certain limits.
And you have prophets.
And you had prophets that was the soul and conscience of the nation. So in speaking to question 1, any individual, because a king is a human being, could be affected by power and by the circumstances that person finds himself in, and he has to work within the law. If you have prophets in a Sanhedrin, you have a hedge against abuse to a certain extent. Today, we live in a world where you don't have prophets, and you don't yet have the Sanhedrin being reinitiated. We look forward to not only Mashiach coming, but one of the requirements for Mashiach coming, who will be a prophet of sorts as well, is that there will be a Sanhedrin to recognize him. So the two go hand in terms of the end of days, in Judaism, and they do work as 2 components of the government of Israel. It seems that the Torah balances the power just because people are human and people can make mistakes. Nobody is perfect. Even prophets were imperfect, even Sanhedrins were imperfect, but you actually need both in order to maintain some kind of a balance and limits.
Excellent. Thank you, Alan. Good start off point. Moshe.
Unmute, Moshe. Moshe, unmute.
To continue what Alan started, in ancient times, the king himself was referred to as a deity. He was God himself. And he had any power he wanted. So nothing could stop him only if somebody killed him. That would stop him. It could be another king, or it could be from inside the people themselves. But in the Jewish thought, of course, it's the other way around. He is a messenger from God to lead the people. Now, there is a specific point that is used that he has a special power of Melech Poretz Gader, which means that a king has the right to break barriers. There are times when leadership has to understand that something very acute, something very special is happening, and the law cannot relate to every situation. And then they have to make decisions. And that's a place where the Torah itself gives the power to the king and to the leadership, and he has to talk to those that are around him. He can do other things. Now, a question I ask myself is, when the Mashiach comes, when Messiah comes, will he be limited by the limits of the king? According to Maimonides, the Rambam, he is just a king that succeeded. Nothing special, he doesn't come from heaven. He's a man, he's a leader from the people themselves. That means that his test is if he succeeds. Now, there is a saying in the Israeli army that sometimes you make decisions in which you receive ot salash or tarash, which rhymes. And the meaning is that either you get an award or you go to jail. So there are times when leadership has to make the decision, and the outcome will be the judge of what will happen to you. That's it.
Excellent. Excellent thoughts. Christy, is your translate? Okay.
Hi, are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I just want to clarify from before. The king has the power, right?
Go ahead, Yonahan.
Okay. Hang on 1 second, please. But how does the king pay attention to all those wives? How are they able to manipulate all those wives? How are they able to manipulate him? Especially with the laws in the Torah say that they're not supposed to have those many wives. When we were talking earlier, you're talking about the king who had all the wives and they manipulated him.
You get to answer this one.
So you're saying between him not being allowed to and how did it actually happen?
Yes.
Unfortunately, we know that not everybody are doing 100% of what they should do.
That's what we said. Even kings are human. They make mistakes.
Either mistake or intentionally. I don't know. But
one view is that the many wives also represented political arrangements with clans and other things. So there may have been other reasons than the carnal, if you will, for that large number of wives as well. So it depends on the individual circumstances and the point in history you're talking about.
Meaning, I guess it also depends on how you defined many, right? We live in a world that one is what 99.9 people are having, but it's not like that in every society. So that's A. And B, I think in the end of the day, and I think that's part of the debate here in the verses, that right, we have the rabbis and we have the judges and so on. But in the end of the day, the king is the king. Meaning, unfortunately, if the king wants to do something, how can the judge actually stop him? It will be very hard. I'm not saying it will be impossible, but a strong king who has his loyal people and loyal army, and if he's, we know this from your local American politics. If the king wants to bend the rules a little bit, it's very hard to stop him.
Here we have the judges that have too much power over the king.
That's the other side of the story, correct? We have this in Israel.
Does that answer your question, Christy? Okay, good. Excellent. Joshua.
Yes, thank you.
Go ahead, Joshua.
Mine is, yeah, thanks, Jonathan, for the presentation. Mine is a clarification about the question, because power and limits, can leader hold great power without being changed by it? Because I thought actually in the enthronement of the king, the anointing, the pouring of the spirit, the pouring of the oil on the king actually got transformed somehow. So I'm struggling with a question because, for example, when was it Samuel? When Samuel anointed King Saul, it says in 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 6, then the Spirit of the Lord came upon, then the Spirit of the Lord will come up upon you mightily, and you shall prophesy with them and be changed into another man. Apparently, the king got a former, I don't know, maybe a clarification. What does that exactly mean? Because, and this is my second question, in regard to the limitations of the king, the law that he had to keep, is it right to say also Hashem keeps the law and is also limited by the law that is established? Or can he act against the Torah that he has established? So those are my questions.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
That was a big setup. Those last questions. Wow. I'd like to point out that for me, when I get asked questions, when I ask myself questions like that, I try to look at the stories in the Tanakh in order to draw inspiration. So first of all, when Jonathan brought several examples of kings that went off the path, it says that Solomon went off the path. He listened to his wives and he strayed. And it says, unlike David, his father. Now that's very interesting because we know that David also had some issues. For example, the sin with Bathsheba. So there is clearly a different kind of straying in both examples. In the case of David, he strayed, but as soon as he strayed, he recognized, of course, he had a prophet who brought him to think about what he had just done, and he recognized that he had sinned. And Psalms is full of his regrets for having done what he did. And later on, when his children do all kinds of crazy things, he accepts all of those crazy things, whether it's Avshalom and Amnon and everything that happens, he accepts them as a punishment or a divine punishment for what he had done. In other words, he is always, his heart is with God. He knows that his job as king is to be the messenger of God, but even a messenger of God can make a mistake. And even a messenger of God can get punished for his mistakes. Solomon, on the other hand, he requested wisdom, he received wisdom, and then he thought that he was smart enough to know what to keep and what not to keep. So he essentially had taken himself beyond the law, and he felt that what he was doing would not impact him, that he would not be impacted by all of these wives. And in the end, of course, he was impacted and he strayed. And he didn't recognize his error. And in the end, the kingdom split. And the consequences were very severe. So I think if we take a look at both of these stories, we can see, I think, some very important principles. The first principle is that the Torah is trying to give the king guidelines that will help him stay the balance, help him walk the right course, go straight in the ways of God, and not let power cause him to think all of a sudden that he can go beyond the law. That's what the Torah does. It even gives a Sefer Torah, a scroll that he has to go with everywhere he goes. Now, I don't know what you think what it would be like to walk around with a Torah scroll everywhere where you go. But I can tell you that even when we put on tefillin on our heads and our arms, we are very careful what kind of thoughts we have. We are very careful not to go in places that are inappropriate. It has an impact on how we behave, and that's why we typically only wear it during the morning prayer, because it's hard to maintain that throughout the day. But the king has to walk with the Torah scroll everywhere that he goes. That has such a huge impact on a person if he's really doing that. Did all of the kings do that commandment? Did they walk around with the Torah scroll everywhere that they went? Unfortunately, they didn't. So the Torah gives commandments, but it's up to the people and it's up to the king. They have free choice whether to do them or not. When the people came to Samuel and they asked for a king for the first time, he was very upset. Why was he upset? Because they didn't ask for a king like David. They actually asked for a king like Saul. They say, we want a king like all of the kings. And like others already mentioned, kings during that time were like gods. They were the law. They did whatever they want. And Samuel even goes through a whole list of things that the king will do if that's the kind of king that they want. Saul, having been chosen to be like all of the kings, we see that he wasn't very careful about doing exactly what God told him to do, and he loses the kingdom as a result of that. But David, on the other hand, he saw himself as a messenger of God. He saw himself as bound to the law. Even if he strayed, he saw himself as being duly punished by God for him straying off. And consequently, David becomes the arch father of the Messiah and of the kings that God promises will ultimately reign forever, because it's that kind of mindset of kingship and that dedication to do what God wants of him and to see himself always as a messenger of God that is bound by the law. That is what causes God to give him the lineage that will ultimately also bring about the Messiah and an everlasting kingdom. And even if they stray on the way, it's that mindset that God wants, because he expects us to make mistakes and to learn from those mistakes. So I hope that I clarified somewhat some of the questions that we answered. Is God bound by the law? I think that's a wonderful question. I just wanted to mention that, to my understanding, God created laws that are just, that are righteous, and God is just and righteous. Therefore, almost by definition, he will always keep the law. But it's his law that he created. It is, according to our sages, the world was created after the law. It was even created with the law as its blueprint. And I have no question in my mind that if I want to understand what is right and what is wrong, I have to study the ways of God in order to be able to try to be true to his ways, because that's what Abraham was chosen for. He was chosen because God says, I know that he will educate his children and the descendants that will follow with God's way of doing justice and compassion. And that's always a balancing act. Because if you can do justice in a way that becomes very non-compassionate, or if you do too much compassion in a way that there is no justice, finding the right balance, that is really, I think, one of our major challenges in this world. And God expects our kings to be able to represent that kind of balance. And the only way for the king to do that is to study the Torah and walk with it everywhere that he goes. So seeing himself as bound by God and the law to execute that balance.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks you, Yair. A very comprehensive answer. We'll have Christy, and then maybe we'll move to the next question, number 2. So go ahead, Christy.
Okay, so my question, Charles, the King of England, his father's mother was Jewish, right? Is that what I've heard? Were they involved in following the rules of Torah?
No. Not
No, I don't think
familiar
they
with.
were.
There's mother of King Charles.
Yeah, she's buried on the Mount of Olives.
Charles, and then his
I
father,
don't think she was Jewish.
William, his mother was William's mother. I thought that I read that somewhere. I could be wrong. But I thought I read that recently. I thought I'd just throw that out there.
But what's the question?
The question was, is King Charles' mother, King Charles's grandmother on his father's side Jewish?
Do you think that the king has somebody walking with him with the Torah, or should he be? Because it's so far, there's no Torah in their lives right now, it seems.
We're talking about an Israeli. There was a Jewish king from Judah, from the lineage of David, so I doubt that this is relevant. I think it's a good idea, though, for everyone to walk with a scroll.
We can now. We all have it on our phones.
According to ChatGPT, there's no Jewish lineage in the English line of succession.
Okay.
However,
right.
the Torah portion speaks about the king writing his own Torah, which is different than just carrying it. I would love to see a leader rise up in this next election and say, part of my duties will be writing a Torah scroll over the course of my tenure. It'd be very interesting to see. I'm waiting for that day. It will happen.
We'll be watching you, Dean. Okay. Shall we go to question 2? The first question was really about the king being corrupted by his power. And the second one is about a king trying to not be above the people. And do we know of people like this nowadays who don't see themselves as being higher than the people? Or does everyone who gets in leadership end up thinking of themselves as much above everyone? Oh, Christiane, go ahead.
Okay. I worked, my whole work experience was in the Canadian government. And so what I saw is that when they were first elected, I'm talking about the prime minister in Canada. We have prime ministers and they name ministers. When they were first elected, they were closer to the people. They remain closer to their people, their constituent in their area. And they were more walking on the line. But if we elected them on the second term, unfortunately, I could see them being led astray. They would be led astray by people wanting this or that, what you call them, they have one idea and they want the government to vote in their favor. So I often felt that people in government should not be elected twice because they were led astray. It's like with great power, there's great responsibility and greater chance for corruption. And in Canada, although I said we were fine, I was not talking about the political Canada. I was talking about us, small people. So that's what I saw as a government employee. They were fine on the first mandate, and on the second one, and they were closer to the elite and not not that close to the people.
It's an interesting comment that you're making, Christiane. I remember the last election where Jagmeet Singh kept voting with the Liberals until he got to the time when he was eligible for his lifelong pension, at the same time as he was talking about how he stood up for all the small working people who didn't have enough. And it's interesting that he himself thought of himself, his personal fortune became more important to him than the actual needs of the people. So thank you for that point. Alan?
I just wanted to comment that in the Torah and throughout the Tanakh, we're talking about the biblical era. We're talking about a different political arrangement where kings are subject to other influences, such as the prophets and the Sanhedrin, and of course, a much more direct relationship with Hashem. When you start using or trying to use that in any analogous way to secular political leadership, there's a problem because secularism is built on a will to power. You want to win, you want to govern, you want to be reelected. It's subject to the forces of money. It's about votes. It's about being able to fool enough of the people some of the time to be able to get the right number of votes. So it's based on a different paradigm and a different dynamic. And there are many more ways in which to distort the system that thwarts the will of what is written in the constitutions of Western democracies. It's difficult to make the analogies because of not only the historical shift, but in the forms of government and what is the will to power. The will to power in biblical Israel is often related to the individual king who wanted to do what he wanted to do, but in political, I should say, secular politicians in the modern era has to do often with either ideology or it's economics or it's about reelection and it's about party affiliation. So it's a different set of dynamics and a different set of pulls on what the politician himself or herself wants to be able to achieve and under what rules they want to operate. So it's a very difficult analogy to make when you go from the Bible to secular political arrangements. So I would caution people on how far to take the analogies.
Good point. Just to comment about your thing about the lineage of the grandmother of King Charles. A couple other people have made comments, but what I read was that she was connected to the Jewish community because she sheltered a family in Athens in the Holocaust and is now one of the righteous among the nations in Yad Vashem. So that's one of the reasons why she might seem to be connected to the
that
Jewish
was
community.
what I read.
Yeah. Joshua.
Right,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say being connected is not being Jewish, though.
That's true. That's true.
That
But,
may be in the confusion. However, I put some information about her.
Yeah, good. Okay. Joshua gone?
Yeah, Alan's use of the word will to power. I'm not sure how he's using that word because I think I met the phrase in Niger, phrases Niger. So just a clarification from Alan. But then just before he clarifies, I think there is the idea of gaiva, the idea of pride or arrogance that usually gets into leaders. And I think that is what the Torah is protecting against, which is the principle, I would say, you will correct me, of the serpent, that the serpent yielded to gaiva, to hubris, to pride. And therefore, that is question 1 and 2. There is a temptation for people to think themselves better than they should. And I think that is what the Torah guards against. And Isaiah 13, 14, Ezekiel 28, that talk about how the Elohim, how this king thought that he could actually inherit the assembly, purpose for which the law is set, because leaders are likely to think themselves better than, or for pride to take over their lives.
Thank you, Joshua. That concept of pride is definitely something that leaders, I think, struggle with. Shall we go to the next question, which is who ultimately governs, the leader, the law, or the higher values? And I guess the commentary that Yonatan gives is, he summarizes it and says, is true leadership the ability to control others or to control yourself? And so what would you say to that? I'm not sure that I could make a distinction between the law and higher values if the law is from God and God is righteous and just. That would be the same thing, or an approximation of the same thing. Do you want to comment on that, Yonatan?
Sure, I definitely agree that in most things it will definitely be the same or almost the same, like you said. But I think it's a more general question, meaning it's not specifically for Jews or Bible observant people. I think it's a general question, right? The question is also relevant for somebody who is, I don't know, a king in India or whatever it is, right? I mean, maybe he's not a religious person, right? So does he needs to be above the law or part of the law, or it's the same question? That's what I meant.
Yeah, I guess it could also apply in a situation where the law might not be righteous, and the king would recognize that, or the leader would recognize that, and choose not to follow the law in favor of what was better, or that
Correct.
what he felt was better.
And then the question is raised, how do we decide which law is, if we give the king the ability to decide a specific law is not righteous enough, or there is a better way to do it, or a more modern way to do it, or whatever we want to call it, then we are opening some kind of opening, for the king can decide almost anything according to that rule. He can bend it to many ways.
I don't know if it's relevant, but I was thinking of the was it this king of Spain that in the Holocaust told all of the people to wear yellow stars so that the Jews couldn't be identified? So he saw that there was something higher than obeying what the law was telling people to do. And in
I
order
think
to
it was maybe Denmark or something like that.
Denmark, that's where it was. So he disobeyed the law by making it impossible to work.
Yeah, the Spanish kingdom never liked Jews from 1492 until today.
Yeah.
They never liked us.
Okay, well, if anybody
606.
else can think of examples of how leaders might not obey the law because of a righteous reason. Okay, Alan, go ahead.
I was going to make a general statement that essentially law sits above any political leader, certainly in the modern era, and the Torah, being the law from God, obviously sits above the king. But there are often emergency situations that call for going beyond the law, but those are temporary aberrations that are meant to be corrected post emergency. So the reality of modern life is, in the United States, the example is, for example, a president can initiate military activity for a period of 60 days, and then there is supposedly limitations on his presidential powers to wage war without a declaration of war from Congress. So he's got some wiggle room according to the law up to the 60-day mark, essentially, though every president since that law was enacted has actually violated it. So there's an example in modern politics of how the laws that man made are being violated on a regular basis, but the intent was to rein in the president initially in his most dangerous beyond the lawmaking capacity.
Excellent. Any other comments about this idea of disobeying the law that's above you because of a higher value? One of the questions that my grandkids ask me all the time is it okay to lie? What about the people who lied to protect people that they were hiding in Second World War?
I would say that's a righteous lie. Even the Bible says,
Right.
like the midwife that protected what was it? Protected the Alan must know, but they lied to the Pharaoh and they protected the boys or
Babies,
whatever.
yeah.
You remember? And it says that they went against the ruler for the sake of
the babies.
the living to upkeep the first law, where life is more important than what. It's not because he's a king that he's perfect.
Again, here's an example of the use of the oral law to interpret the written law. So we have a principle called Pikuach Nefesh. It's to save a life. And according to our understanding of the law, it literally overrides 610 of the 613 commandments. In other words, if a life is at stake, you get in a car on Shabbos, you take that person to the hospital. You're violating the Sabbath, but you're allowed to violate the Sabbath. In fact, it's considered to be a higher commandment observance to violate the Sabbath because you're required to do it. And it's called Pikuach Nefesh, to save a life. So these are the exigent circumstances I was alluding to before, like in the case of warfare or something like that. But in the case of any emergency, you're allowed to violate certain laws in order to protect life or to minimize the impact on life in that respect.
Who determines what is righteous lying? Because Muslims believe in that for certain purposes. So I think we're told that we can disobey the laws of man if the law is going against God's law. Correct?
Yes.
Shall we go with Neil and then we can think about that question? That's a really good one.
I think what Alan brought up is very truthful, speaking of the truth. Saving a life, I think the other one I've heard this before is that keeping the peace, but also the 10 Commandments. If you go look at the 10 Commandments, the 10th commandment, the commandment about Lashon Hara, telling stories, lies, which deals with the truth as well, it trumps all the rest of them. As far as living the proper life as a leader, as a king or prime minister, those things are very important. Regardless, though, I think of, as we've talked about here, about kings that have tended to take their power. I'm sure all of you heard the saying about power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I don't know if it's a nature of man. I don't think it is everyone, but power tends to erode a lot of the things that even the finest of character of admirable people hold. But once they become in office, once they become political leaders, and I've heard this in America, that a legislator gets elected to office and he represents an area. And once that say it's a congressman, once he becomes elected, he says, why do I need to go back to the people? They elected me to make the decisions. I've wondered about this a little bit in Israel because I understand it's not a representative democracy in some areas as much as maybe in places, say in a county in the United States where it has a township or a borough or a city, and it's broken down in finer units of government. But I think leaders cannot let hold of what people want in some form or fashion for them to make their decisions. And that, I think, obviously, they need to have divine guidance as well. Just a few thoughts.
You're muted, Ruth.
Alan, thank you, Neil.
I just wanted to comment on what Leah said about Islamic law. My understanding about the Hadith in the Islamic law is that the political implications of lying are allowed in order to trump other religions. For example, in Islamic law, you're allowed to claim you're signing a peace deal when in fact it's really a hutna. And the hutna in Arabic usually means a temporary peace or a temporary lull or ceasefire. It's not really peace as you and I might define peace. Peace is a state of stability where everybody's in agreement and we're hoping it's going to be a long-lived peace. In Islamic law, that concept and even the word is different than what we have in the West. So Islamic law allows that because of the religious supremacy Islam places on conquering Christendom, of conquering Judaism, and literally taking territory and inhabiting land and governing on a worldwide basis. So that supersessionist ideology is built into Islamic law. You don't have that in Torah. You don't have that necessarily in the New Testament either.
Who was it that asked that
Thank
question?
you.
Was it Leah? Was that helpful, Leah?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Any other comments on, let's see, we didn't quite get to the fourth question. Let's just have a look there. 4 is what makes Saul and Solomon, what makes a leader truly great? Listening to the people, standing by what he believes is right. And do even wise and successful leaders lead limits to keep power from changing them? I think we addressed that a little bit earlier, but if anyone else has other thoughts or comments, we can go to those now. Yeah, Ear.
Just to somewhat address the fourth question, I think the way we look at leadership, it's the people relinquishing their power to a leader. And throughout the Tanakh, when we see people going to someone asking him to be their leader, then he asks them, will you accept my judgment? Or will you accept whatever I decide? In other words, it's the people who have to relinquish their power. And to some degree, that's what happened with Saul and Samuel, was the people said, for us to have somebody who will fight our wars, we're willing to give them absolute power. I think the Torah is not interested in that at all. The Torah really wants people to maintain their power as much as possible. So leadership really is a balance between the people deciding in what areas does the king or the leader have jurisdiction and is able to make decisions, of course, subject to the law, not being above the law, but subject to the law, except with extreme cases that Moshe Chassid also related to in the beginning. But the king basically has his dominion over certain areas that the people decided to give him jurisdiction. And when it comes to other matters, it may go down to the people, and the people say, we want to decide on certain issues, and the king cannot decide on those issues, of course, all in deference to the law. So I think that there is a balance between leadership power, people power, and of course, both of them being subject to the law, which we see in the U.S. Constitution. I think that was a way of seeking the right check and balances, and it doesn't always work, but that's basically what they're trying to achieve. And I believe that the same thing is in Israeli law as well. There are certain areas where the prime minister has power, and there are other areas where he doesn't have power. And I think that ultimately it will become the decision of the people to what an extent does the leader have jurisdiction, and of course, always in deference to the law. But I don't think that in modern day societies, the leader has absolute power and is able to make any decision that he wants. In almost any country that is democratic, there are always limitations besides the law of the people deciding that the king can't decide on, or the leader, the prime minister, the president cannot decide on certain issues. They remain, I think, within. So sometimes a good leader, answering this question, should listen to the people. In other words, he shouldn't be listening to the people whether to do what the Torah tells him to do. That when it comes to listening to the Torah, he shouldn't be listening to the people. When it comes to things beyond that realm of what the Torah commands, then he should be attentive also to what the people are willing for him to do in the realm of with what is he allowed to make decisions on, and what should he confer with the people regarding those decisions. And that has to do with a lot of issues, for example, with budgets and taxes and a whole lot of other things. It's very important to take into consideration also what the people are willing to do and not willing to do.
Thank you, Ira. I've heard it summed up as being the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. So in American law, anyway, and in Canadian too, there's 3 levels of checks and balances on any one group. Leah, go ahead.
I'm just curious, bouncing off of what Joshua mentioned in a verse about the kings being basically inaugurated by God and given his Holy Spirit. Does that same authority apply to today's leaders? And if so, how would that affect their authority or restrict their authority?
Sorry, if I may borrow and leave from Yair, what Yair said about the stories in the Tanakh.
David and Saul.
Exactly,
David and Saul. Yeah.
David probably is the best example of somebody who received the Spirit and acted actually really along the lines of the Torah. With his struggle with David, for his struggle with Saul, his choice not to take the life of Saul, and he was very restrained in his exercise of authority and power, all the way to his enthronement in Hebron and then later in Jerusalem. That's the way I look at the whole idea of being invested with the Spirit of Hashem. But I guess my Jewish friends have greater insight into this. Thank you.
No, I don't. I want to strengthen what you say. I think that God wants all of us to make decisions. Doesn't want us to just say, okay, let the king decide. I think he wants us to be part of the decision-making process. And I think, therefore, that there is definitely, to go ahead and say God anointed someone and that person is going to make all the decisions, I don't think that's the spirit of the Torah. And I think the spirit of the Torah, it really wants to empower all of us to have a direct connection to God, to be able to make decisions in whatever realm we have jurisdiction over, certainly within our local in our local domains. The king is really given the power to deal with things that we can't deal with as individuals. We can't fight wars. We can't take justice into our own hands. So therefore, there is, I think, in the Torah, a very clear line between that which the king gets involved in and makes decisions in, and things that the Sanhedrin decides upon, and things that the priesthood decides upon on matters within the temple. The king doesn't get involved in those areas.
Excellent. Good. Okay, so Dave, would you like to introduce?
There have been lots of comments about the democracies that all 3 of these countries are. And I just thought I would pull from the Declaration of Independence because it creates some very, very interesting parameters. And all of it's good. I'm not going to read the whole declaration, but the famous parts. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then it goes on that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So a core principle is that
exactly
representative democracy or republican government or parliamentary government, the idea is that every few years and every few offices, the people have the right to consent to who is going to be doing that. And so I just think that's a marvelous thing. And then John Adams said that the Constitution, which obviously this is the Declaration, but the Constitution was designed and could only work in the context of a moral and religious people. That's it. That otherwise it would become what, frankly, the United States is becoming, which is anarchy.
Scary thought. I was thinking when Leah was talking about Cyrus being anointed, he was even called Mashiach, I think. He didn't know he was anointed by God, but he was to set the people to go back home. So different ways of thinking about that.
But the whole Cyrus thing is really interesting because there's an implication that there's an act of God through divine providence operating. Divine providence is issued by God. God is manipulating somebody to play a role in order to either correct a situation or go in a certain direction to offset how human beings may have messed up the plan. All right, God plans, the rest of us make our own decisions. We usually get off the track of the plan, and God intervenes either overtly or covertly through divine providence to rectify it, though it isn't always instantaneous. It sometimes takes time. It can even take years or even decades to get back on plan because of human perfidy or imperfections.
Exactly. I think that's a good note to end on, unless someone has a final comment.
I just wanted to point out that during the tribes, every tribe had their own courts. The idea really is not to centralize power, it's to distribute it and to allow the people, especially to the degree possible when it comes to tribes, to allow them the autonomy so that they become part of making justice and compassion and balancing that. That's something that all of us have to learn to do in whatever domain we have jurisdiction.
Alan, last word. Were you going to say something?
No, it's been covered.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Okay,
I
well,
want to add a last word.
okay, Dave.
Just to be a little inspirational here. There's a day coming when the mountain of God's house will be the mountain, solid, towering over all mountains. All nations will river toward it. People will set out for it. They will say, "Come, let us climb God's mountain to go to the house of the God of Jacob. He will show us the way he works so we can live the way we're made." And then obviously at that point, we will be turning our swords into shovels and our spears into pruning hooks. So
Excellent.
Claire, that's the happy ending.
That's the greater migration than purple martins, Canada geese, wildebeest with zebras. That's when all nations, all tribes are gathering and going up to Jerusalem.
Tying it all together. Thank you, Dean. So thanks everyone for the great discussion, and especially Yonatan for his great presentation.
Thank you, guys.
Got a good discussion going, and we'll see you all next week.